That Tuesday, Mr Marengo worked late. Again. He frequently did work late. In fact, if he sat down and ever totalled it up, he would realise that he probably worked more late than on time. Although, in fairness, Mr Marengo did not wholly mind this. On the occasions when he did finish work on time, he had to crowd into the underground trains through London with what felt like hundreds upon hundreds of other people. And Mr Marengo did not particularly like other people. He didn't like to be close enough to random strangers to be touched by them, to have to smell them, whether they're cheap aftershave or their overly used perfumes, or their sweaty armpits, or their other odours. He didn't like having to listen to them, prattling away on the phones, chattering away to each other, gulping and slurping at food and drink. He didn't like people in any real context. And on those occasions, like tonight, when he finished late, he would have to obviously catch one of the later trains going through the underground, and the later trains were never as crowded as the earlier trains. And on this particular occasion, tired as he was, staggering out of the office, eyes heavy, he made his way to the train and found that there were perhaps a dozen people in the carriage, and he had quite a few stops to go before arriving at his final destination. And most of those dozen or so people got off at earlier stops and nobody else got on. So the train became more and more Spartan as it rattled its way through the dark tunnels of the underground. He felt his concentration, his consciousness phasing in and out. It had been a long, long day, and there were many things to worry about at work. There was very little to worry about at home, for Mr Marengo lived alone. He had lived alone practically his whole life. No wife, no children, no real friends to speak of. He knew the people he worked with, but only in passing to pass the time of day. Most of what they talked about was to do with work itself. He knew little and, to be honest, was not really interested in learning more about the private lives of his colleagues. But there were times, particularly late at night, particularly early in the morning when he was finding it difficult to sleep, when he would be acutely conscious of his loneliness. He had thought about getting a cat. He wasn't a dog person. The idea of all those hairs all over the house put him off. And dogs, of course, are very physically demanding, and he didn't particularly want to be demanded upon. So a cat had seemed a more viable option, but he thought of the nights when he worked later and later and later, and it didn't really seem fair to have a cat waiting at home, wanting to be fed, wanting to have its litter tray changed, wanting to be looked after in some capacity, and he seldom there. And so he didn't even have the companionship of an animal when he got home. And he would lie in his bed at night, trying to get to sleep, tossing and turning, looking around his rather shabby little room. For his job, though demanding, did not pay well, and London rents got higher and higher and higher, and food prices and bills and everything in London got higher and higher and higher, and his wages stayed much the same, so he was able to afford less and less to show for all of the efforts he put into work. And there were times at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning when he wondered if it was all worth it. He was, by then, approaching his late middle age. Retirement was only a few years away, and he wondered what he would retire to. There would be no cottage with flowers round the door, no allotment to tend to, no wife to go on holidays with, no children to visit, no friends to spend time with, and he had very little time for hobbies or anything like that to occupy his time with. He was aware that other colleagues who had retired would occasionally get into contact, not with him, of course, but with other people in the office, and share details of holidays they were on and activities that they were getting up to. Mr Marengo was acutely aware that he would have none of that. And at those difficult times in the early hours of the morning, he sometimes wondered, were he, on the next day, into work, to stand on the edge of the train platform and feel his legs going? And sometimes he actually did. He was so tired some days, not only tired coming home of an evening, but tired getting up so very early in the morning. And sometimes he did feel a little doddery on his pins, just the sheer exhaustion of it all. There had been occasions when he'd stumbled, almost fallen, not under a train, but in the hustle and bustle of going up and down the escalators. And so he wondered, if he were to fall under a train, would anyone attend his funeral? Who would there be to notice? His various relatives were either dead or long since moved away and lost contact with. Would anyone from work attend, and if they did, would it be a mere perfunctory gesture by someone who barely knew him, just to tick a box and say that they'd done it? He would be replaced at work soon enough, probably before his body was even laid out on a mortuary slab. He'd be replaced. It wasn't much to show for a life. And certainly that evening, as he'd staggered down onto the platform itself and stood there waiting and waiting, listening to the winds whistling up and down the train tunnels, he had once again had those rather bleak thoughts about standing on the edge of the platform and wondering if it would really matter if he was no longer there. But the train had come in, and somebody had walked behind him, ready to get onto the train themselves, and the prospect of throwing himself under a train in front of some random stranger did not appeal to him, and the idea soon blew away upon the breeze from the train as it pulled into the station. And Mr Marengo got onto his seat. He liked to sit on the one nearest to the door, if at all possible. And the train rattled away, and he tried to lose himself in the newspaper. And he suddenly started. The train rocked. And he came out of his reverie, thinking about his thoughts of what he might or might not do to himself upon the train station, and realised that the name of the platform that the train was pulling into was not one that he was familiar with, certainly not one that he passed again and again and again on his journeys to and fro from work. And he realised that he might have phased out completely. Had he missed his platform? He jumped up and looked at the map of the underground, trying to locate the station as the train pulled out, and he found himself rattling and shaking and trying to hold on, trying to maintain his feet as he looked at the map, trying not to draw attention by looking too agitated. There were only 3 other people in the carriage, one of whom he vaguely recognised as someone he'd often seen in the carriages before. He didn't know the man's name, he didn't know anybody's name, but he'd seen him a few times, a dreary little man. The only thing memorable about him was his rather battered and tatty looking bowler hat, which had led Mr Marengo to think of the man as Mr Bowler, whatever his real name might be. He had an eminently forgettable face, middle-aged and grey and pale, and hardly there at all, thin, emaciated little thing in shabby clothing. And as usual, on those occasions when he'd seen him dozens and dozens of times before on the journeys to and from work, Mr Bowler just sat there, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. He never, that Mr Marengo had ever noticed, he never read a newspaper, he never read a book, he never produced a mobile phone, he never chatted to anybody. He just always seemed to slump there, looking disconsolate. Mr Marengo thought momentarily about going up to Mr Bowler and asking him quite where they were upon the line, explaining that he had perhaps nodded off a little bit and lost himself in his thoughts, and he may have missed the station. And did Mr Bowler perhaps know if there was a train back if he got out at the next station? How easily would he be able to get back to the correct station? But Mr Marengo was not one to strike up conversation with, well, even with people he vaguely knew, let alone with absolute strangers. And there was two others in the carriage. There was a woman he'd seen sometimes and come to think of as Mrs Parrot, simply because almost every time he saw her she had a different coloured hair. Today it was a livid shade of blue. On previous occasions she had had purple hair, pillar box red hair, pitch black hair, bright vivid yellow hair. She chopped and changed with alarming regularity, and slightly to Mr Marengo's mild amusement, she wasn't a teenager whom you might expect to experiment with wild hairstyles. She was a woman probably roughly Mr Marengo's age, maybe even a little older. Short and stout, and often vividly, rather larily dressed, and forever changing the colour of her hair. But again, the prospect of going up to an absolute stranger and explaining his confusion, his dilemma, because the more he squinted at the map above the doors, the harder it was to find quite which station he was at, and the name of the station he'd just passed. He must be awfully tired, because it had slipped from his mind already. He could find his own station, he knew where he wanted to be quite easily on the map, but quite where he actually was now he wasn't wholly sure. And as he was thinking about this, there resounded from the far end of the carriage an enormous echoing belch. And Mrs Parrot and Mr Marengo himself both glared at that end of the carriage. Quiet little Mr Bowler still sat there slumped, staring at the floor. And at the far end of the carriage was a youngish man, maybe mid-30s, maybe late 30s, quite tall, broad-shouldered, but running to a paunch. And he was swigging from a can of beer, and there were 2 or 3 empty cans of beer littered on the floor around him. And as the man swung round to look back at them, he bellowed, "What? What do you fucking want?" And immediately Mrs Parrot and Mr Marengo stared back at Marengo at his newspaper, Mrs Parrot out the window, pretending not to have made eye contact with the belligerent drunk. Miss Marengo sat there wondering what to do. He certainly didn't want to talk to some belligerent drunk who probably wouldn't be the least bit of help, even if he knew the interconnecting routes of the stations. Should he speak to the woman with the livid coloured hair? Should he speak to the dreary little man in the bowler hat? He really didn't know quite what to do. And once again there echoed from the other end of the carriage another belligerent "What do you want?" directed at nobody in particular. And Mr Marengo began to get agitated. There were few things he disliked more than aggressive drunks. And unfortunately the London Underground had more than its share of strange and belligerent people travelling its routes. The man lurched to his feet. Marengo cast a side eye at him and contemplated the likely risk, the likely threat that this man posed. He was quite noticeably bigger and broader than Marengo himself, and if it came to a fight, Marengo thought to himself that he did not fancy his own chances, nor could he imagine Mrs Parrot or little Mr Bowler being an awful lot of use in coming to his aid if something were to kick off. The drunk staggered several steps. The train lurched and the man fell back against a seat, effing and blinding, before pulling himself back upright again and staggering closer to the other 3 people on the train. The woman looked flustered. She gathered her bits about her, her bags, her handbag, her various odds and ends, and glanced at the train station, glanced at her watch, glanced at the door, and just then the train pulled into another station. And the woman, whether this generally was her station or she simply wanted to get away from the drunk as quickly as possible, Marengo didn't know, but she snatched up all of her bits and rushed out the door the instant it was opened. Miss Marengo glanced at the nameplate on the station wall and again didn't recognise this either. It wasn't a station he had ever been through in any of his travels upon the underground, and he stared at the map above the door, trying to locate where it was. Even if he couldn't remember the name of the previous station, at least now he knew the name of this one. And the doors swung shut, and Marengo thought, well, maybe he should have got out, maybe he should have followed that woman's example, and at least found a member of staff in the London Underground, which would frankly be a miracle, but find one and get directions back home, back to where he needed to go to make whatever interconnecting routes he needed to make. But it was already too late, so the doors were shut and the train was starting to rock and move and pull out of the station. And he stared at the map and the drunk bellowed, "What are you looking at? You lost or summit?" Marengo mumbled and stumbled something incomprehensible, not wanting to engage the man in conversation, but equally not wanting to be accused of being ignorant or rude. For the drunk looked as belligerent as only large drunks can get. And suddenly, Marengo realised that the drunk was not bellowing at him, he was bellowing at little Mr Bowler, who simply sat there, quietly, staring at his feet, not answering, not responding, not even appearing to notice that he had been bellowed at. The man raged and roared and reached down and grabbed little Mr Bowler by his lapels and hauled him to his feet. Marengo stood there dithering, pulled between looking at the map, trying to locate where he was and where home was, and wondering whether he should do something, say something, pull the cord to gain the attention of the train staff, wondering if they could actually see what was happening on the various cameras located around the length of the train. And if they could, why was nobody coming to help? Why was nobody intervening? Where was the railway police to help? All of these thoughts flashed quickly through his mind, and the next he knew, the little man was hauled to his feet, being shaken like a rag doll by the belligerent drunk who was roaring and raging incomprehensibly. What he was angry about, Marengo couldn't begin to speculate. Perhaps even the man himself didn't know he was in such a state of drunkenness. He just felt like raging at someone, and little Mr Bowler would do. Marengo took 2 steps forward and stopped. What use could he be in protecting the little man? If he said anything to the drunk, he might fall victim next to the man's raging and roaring. And before he could dither any more, the drunk, whether deliberately, whether because of the rocking of the train, pushed the little man away from him. Mr Bowler staggered and fell and stumbled and smacked his head against one of the handrails that supported floor to ceiling and slid down to the ground. Marengo gasped, realising the man had at least been bruised, if not more seriously hurt, as the little man lay there looking stunned, trying to pull himself up on the very handrail that his head had smashed into. The drunk belched again and turned it into a half-echoing laugh. Marengo took another step forward, wondering if he should bend down and help the little man to his feet more properly, if he should push the drunk away, if he should produce his own mobile phone and call the police. But doing so, of course, would undoubtedly draw the wrath of the drunk. What should he do? He didn't know. And that's when he heard a noise somewhere between a gasp and a squeal and a screech. And at first he assumed it was coming from little Mr Bowler. Maybe he had injured his head more badly than initially suspected. But as he watched, Mr Marengo realised that it wasn't the tiny little man who was making this peculiar noise. It was emanating from the drunk himself, who stood, a hand clamped to his mouth, looking as if he might be violently sick, and pointing at little Mr Bowler. Mr Marengo's eyes followed the length of the drunk's fingers and came to rest upon little Mr Bowler, expecting to see maybe blood pouring down from an injury in the man's head, or perhaps from his nose if he'd smashed his nose against the metal pole. It wasn't blood that was pouring. It was his face that was hanging half off. And it took several moments for Mr Marengo to make sense of what he was seeing. It was as if the face had smashed, but not bruised, not cut, not bones protruding, but smashed like breaking the head of a china doll. Bits of it were hanging, swinging, bits of cheekbone, bits of forehead, bits of eye socket. Not bleeding, not gushing as one might expect from some horrific injury, but just hanging there. And suddenly Marengo thought to himself, is it a mask? Is he wearing a mask? And he could see that there was something underneath the broken, jagged hole in the man's face. And a piece of what might have been cheekbone clattered to the floor. But not like china, not like paper mache or something that a mask might be made out of. When it hit the floor, it hit it with a squelch. The squelch that one might expect from a gobbet of flesh. Mr Marengo's stomach turned. The drunk looked as if he might heave his beer straight back up again. Because as the little man looked wildly round the carriage, Mr Marengo could see that what was underneath the broken part of his face was a pellucid, pulsating, almost waxy yellow substance. An eye stared madly at him, red and bloodshot, looking more than a little bit unhinged. The peculiar little man swung round to face the drunk, who staggered back. A hand crept out, groping blindly towards the drunk man, who roared and tried to bat it away. And at that moment the train carriage lurched once again, and the drunk staggered back, fell on his backside, hit his own head against another one of the poles, and slid to a heap on the floor. Whether passed out from drunkenness or from shock or knocked unconscious by the pole, Mr Marengo didn't know. Little Mr Bowler knelt down beside the drunk. His fingers, which Mr Bowler noticed for the first time, were strangely soft and supple and moved in directions that normal fingers should not move in, brushed the drunk's face, stroked it, caressed it, and little Mr Bowler began to make strange cooing and gurgling noises, almost like the noises somebody might make over a baby or a puppy, rocking back and forth, stroking and gurgling and googling and mewling almost. A shiver ran down Mr Marengo's spine. And at length, as he stood watching, the destination problems he was facing gone temporarily from his mind, little Mr Bowler shook his head sadly and made a sighing noise, standing up, tutting almost with disappointment, with disgust, and swung round to face Mr Marengo. And he could see now that the man was more full frontal towards him, face on, that the blow against the metal pole had such an effect that it looked as if the face was not only broken with a great hole there where the eye used to be, but crack marks were spreading even as he watched. Bits flaked off, bits of chin, bits of nose, an ear flaked off and fell off like a shattering mask, and landed with a sickly squelch upon the floor of the carriage. Mr Marengo staggered back, his knees getting weaker and weaker, and he backed into the seat, causing his knees to buckle, and he fell heavily into the seat. Little Mr Bowler approached closer and closer, the fingers stretching out, wiggling in the most untoward of directions, a smile spreading across his bland little face. But even as the smile spread and the muscles stretched, the cracks got deeper, and more bits of flesh, more bits of face fell off and landed with a splat upon the carriage floor. And what was underneath seemed to throb and pulse and move with a life of its own, not bleeding, but rancid and unpleasant. And a smell began to emanate as little Mr Bowler got close enough for Mr Marengo to pick up on the odours. A smell like rotting fish, like something from Billingsgate in the wee small hours of the morning, something that people at Billingsgate would throw out down the nearest drain. It was so rank. He tried to yell, he tried to scream, a hand fumbled towards a pocket in search of a mobile phone. But those fingers, those worm-like wriggling fingers, began to caress and caress, softly, 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 stroking Mr Marengo's skin. And little Mr Bowler, for the first time, and indeed the last time in Mr Marengo's life, spoke and said, "Oh, such a face. I yearn for such a face. Mine is broken. You are not using yours. Give me your face. Give me your face." And it may be that Mr Marengo passed out with sheer shock, or it may be that some substance oozing from those wiggling worm-like fingers stroking his face caused him to fall into unconsciousness. But Mr Marengo never awoke again. But he was often seen travelling back and forth at very strange hours of the day and night upon the route of the London Underground, dressed in his familiar but increasingly tatty suit and a increasingly shabby and battered looking bowler hat. And if anyone ever noticed that the other Mr Bowler was never seen again upon the train, nobody commented, but then nobody probably noticed him in the first place.